everybody, and thank you for coming around the table today, literally and figuratively. As you know, my background is a very eclectic mix. I actually started out as a historian of land tenure and agrarian reform in Colombia when that was a popular area to study in the 1970s. Ironically, it seems that over almost 40 years later, I've come full circle and I'm looking again at the land, not so much as an issue, although it was related to religion. I use the Jesuit records as my source of information, but to look at whether food drives peace or war and how to look at food in a different way. So I called this lecture Coming Around the Table when Christine and Joe and I were getting together because actually the table is such a symbolic place for not only being a piece of furniture, but where the family gathers, where negotiations happen, where many things take place, and where ritual in a diverse range of religions also happens. And so when you sit down at a table tonight or with your family or over the holidays after this talk, maybe you'll think a little bit more about what you're doing and the symbolism of the things that you do, even if it's just sharing a meal with a relative or someone you don't even know at these common tables in restaurants, and what it means for your own interrelationship with other human beings. Because basically, eating in a way with manners and certain rules is something that is very much a trait of being a human being. And I'll get into that more. But I couldn't resist. I am a junkie when it comes to looking at articles about food, which seem to be overwhelming the internet. And especially in your generation, food has become the new drug in many ways. There's food porn, although the erotic pictures of food. There is food that people write about in websites like Munchies. There's a website called Eater DC where people offer meals and you bid on them and go to their houses. So there's a whole new focus on eating. But I think what all of these sites miss is the historical background to why they want to come together around a table. So in one of my perusings, this came out of First We Feast, which is another interesting website. I have a list of them, is that Pope Francis said that what he misses the most is going to get a pizza anonymously. So look at you lucky people, you can get a pizza anonymously. He said that the thing that he loved most in his life in Buenos Aires, and he's of course an Italian Argentine who comes from a very big Italian Catholic family, is going and getting a pizza, which I must say in Buenos Aires is quite good because of the large number of Argentine Italians that live there. Some of the best Italian food I've ever had in the world. But it was interesting that there he was and saying, asking a pope of what he missed the most, it was eating pizza. So even the Pope is not immune from this phenomena of what food means in terms of symbolism, in terms of memory, in terms of communication. How many of you have specific food memories? Good and bad? Everybody. I mean, can I call on you and ask, what's your most vivid food memory?
Actually, recently I learned a new recipe, so when I went home for spring break, I was able to make it for my family, and they really enjoyed it.
And what was the recipe?
It was just cooking chicken, but with like Italian dressing sauce and homemade mashed potatoes.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
And they liked it.
Yeah.
And what did it do in your family? Did it create a conversation, or did it?
It did, because usually my grandma's the one who cooks, and so they, I was able to give them a chance to hang out with the new baby, and I was cooked, and we had conversation over the table.
Anybody else have a good food memory? Yes.
Well, so I'm from India, and so my family, in India we have this thing. It's kind of like called ramen. It's kind of ramen noodles, but it's more spicy, has more flavors. It's called Maggi noodles. So when I came to college for the first time here, I didn't really understand what ramen noodles, how that kind of worked without Maggi noodles here, and how they don't have that in the United States, why that's a thing. So I was showing one of my buddies, Jake, about Maggi noodles, and I really vividly remember this memory because me, Jake, and then my other buddy Abram were sitting down at the table, and we were all having Maggi noodles, and I was telling them, and the look on their faces, they were like, "Wow, this is so much better." And,
Well, a lot of things are better than those little packages of ramen, but I think most of us. I remember when they came out, I was in graduate school, and I thought they were the most incredible invention ever, to be able to pour boiling water on something and have instant food. I mean, this was a long time ago, but I remember them in the graduate student offices at Washington University. We were just amazed that something would come out of a little cup like that. But it is, in fact, a staple. But what part of India is your family from?
South India.
From South India. So that's another phenomena. So you've already given me examples as food as a tool of memory and communication. Anybody else have an example? Yes, Professor.
Cook. And I never made a turkey.
Oh.
And my daughter is now a vegetarian, and I think this contributed to it. I never cooked a turkey. I bought Cornish game hens. And I was laughing because it used to be Pizza Hut used to have personal pan pizzas. So I told her we were having personal pan turkeys for dinner. And when I put them out on the table, she said, "It looks just like our dog." That was the last time she ate meat.
Well, I mean, that does tell you something about how we associate food with life, and it's a very powerful memory. Some people also, and in my course on conflict cuisines, I talk about food in diasporas, and your story from India is very much a piece of that diaspora experience, because in Washington, they used to be saying that, you could always tell where the next war was by the new restaurants. And, I remember when Afghanistan cooking came to Washington in the late 1970s, and then Vietnamese cooking, which was here when the war ended in 1975. How many of you have ever been out to the Eden Center? Of course,
Well, I
you
live in
have.
Virginia.
You live- Well, in the Eden Center, which is at Seven Corners, is a football field-sized shopping mall, which is entirely run by Vietnamese merchants. And it flies the flag of the Republic of South Vietnam, which is no longer because the country's united after the peace accords. But what's interesting is that food is memory. When you can't go home, one of the most powerful things in international relations is that people of all classes and all communities suddenly organize themselves around a particular food. And that's true in the Vietnamese community. It's even true in the Afghan community. It's true in the Ethiopian community. Why is Washington so full of Ethiopian Well, for those of you who've studied political science or history, Ethiopia had one of the worst famines and then a horrific civil war with a guerrilla warfare that lasted for almost a decade, and people fled. And Washington has, in the United States, the largest population of Ethiopian diaspora. The official census says there are about 250,000 of them. More technically, we think there are 500,000 Ethiopians that live here. But go to any parking garage or go to any taxi cab in the District of Columbia and you will meet Ethiopian. In fact, tomorrow my class goes and has an Ethiopian meal because we organize around diasporas, and we meet with the merchants and we meet with the community members to hear about why this food still has a tremendous hold upon its population, even though they no longer live there. And you wouldn't think about it, but you were probably not even born during the civil wars in Central America. But those civil wars also produced a large number of refugees and continue to produce different kinds of refugees, of which Washington has the second largest of those groups from El Salvador. And El Salvadorians, too, organize themselves along food communities. I'm in the process of writing an article now about the El Salvadorian restaurants, which, almost 2 decades after the Civil War has ended, and I think you have something on Romero's on Tuesday, the anniversary of the bishop who was killed, that El Salvador still has this huge number of El Salvadorians who work, who cook, who live here. Most of them are legal, fortunately, because of laws that were changed, and still want their local food. But let me tell you an interesting phenomena about this. In addition to food being memory and organizing a community, food creates new market value chains. When I went to the Embassy of El Salvador to talk about the proliferation of El Salvadorian food, when I was organizing this class I was teaching, Salvadorians use certain products. They like dairy products for their beans and they like certain cheeses, and you can find them in the giant supermarket now or the Safeway, and that's because enterprising Salvadorians who came here founded dairy in Delaware, bought it eventually as a cooperative, and started producing local cheese. Before, they would carry it in their suitcase and run the risk of a nice little beagle finding it from the Department of Agriculture, but now they have their own value chain. So not only does the food create the memory and the communication, but it also creates a new market chain. And this is very important because food is a tool of economic empowerment. When you are a refugee and you come here, often even if you're a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, a dentist, your licensing will not be valid. But the one thing you can bring here are your recipes and your members of your family who can cook food, and that becomes the basis of livelihood. And if you talk to every single person that I've talked to in the community, from Bosnians who own a cafe on Route 1 to Afghans who are highly educated and ambassadors who come, they all know that they at least can cook. And if they can cook, they can feed their families, and if they can feed their families, they can feed others. And it's much easier to get a license to open a restaurant than it is to practice medicine, as we know. So they do this. But what's even more interesting is that as these communities integrate, and food is a tool of integration into communities, their children sometimes are successful, they become Americans, and they don't want to cook. So what happens? The next generation of immigrants come and cook. So if you go to the Eden Center, which represents the largest, the Vietnamese diaspora, which is the oldest in terms of the post-Second World War population, the people who cook Honduran food today are Honduran. Why? Because that's where people are coming from. And Hondurans, you don't need to speak English to be a cook. And some of the best chefs now out in the Eden Center have learned from the Vietnamese older family members, and they now provide and purvey food in the kitchen. So there is a whole cycle in diaspora cooking that is very, very important in terms of integrating themselves into a population, integrating themselves into a new community. I mean, how many of you think about Chinese food as a foreign food now? Oh, nobody raised their hand. What about Mexican food? I mean, it's part of our culture. Chipotle has made everybody understand that there is food south of the border. If you have a chance, and I just say this as an aside, the Smithsonian American History Museum has a wonderful exhibit as part of its ongoing interest in this area on food. And it goes through the different integration of food and food trends in the United States, and it has a showcase on the Mexican food because it was really because of the bracero movement, the movement of workers across the border, and the fact that so much of our food is grown cross-border by and farmed by Mexican Americans or Mexicans coming back and forth, that Mexican food became part of the diet, particularly in the American Southwest. But that is no longer limited to the Southwest of the United States. And so when you talk about food as a community, you really can see how this impacts a city like Washington, where you have so many different people coming from around the world and having this tool, this recipe book that they carry with them to be able to share with others. In my class, which I hope some of you, if you're not seniors yet, will take as a capstone next year, we talk about different cuisines. This year I had Vietnamese, and I had, instead of Afghanistan, I had Iranian food because the Iranians are interesting. How many of you remember in 1979 there was a revolution in Iran? I know. I know. We can hope that history classes helped. So you wouldn't remember as a live real-time event, but you probably understand that we had an embassy in Tehran. Well, you saw the movie Argo? All right, so if you saw the movie Argo, you understand what happened in Iran, right? I don't have to go to a history book.
Ben Stiller. I mean, not right. Ben Stiller, Ben Affleck.
Yeah, so in Argo, I mean, the United States Embassy is invaded. It's taken over. We have 400 hostages. No, they're on 400. They're kept for 400 and some odd days. A terrible part of history for both countries, and a very Islamic right-wing revolution takes place in a country that was once the center of education and women's rights suddenly goes to the complete other side. Well, in Washington, there is an Iranian restaurant, but you'd never know it. It's called Peacock Cafe in Georgetown. It's a very lovely little place. It looks like it's next door to Cafe Milano. It's on a good block on The owner is an Iranian who, with his brother, came here and opened a sandwich shop. How many of you like Moby Dick? Same phenomena. Moby Dick was a chain in Tehran, and they came here and opened up because that's how they were able to earn a living when they came here. Anyway, Maziar Faria, the chef of that restaurant, I got to meet because he's part of the chef corps, which I'll tell you about later. And he said a few years ago, as relations started to open up between the United States and Iran, he felt he could, quote, come out of the closet with his Iranian cooking. Because before they would serve the garden variety stuff you get in brunch, and he started making Iranian food, and he sent out some notes to Iranian customers. And he said the old grandmothers and the mothers came in and he said, oh, this is what food tasted like when we were young in Tehran. Now he has a full Iranian set of plates to offer on his restaurant table. And he also talks about the acceptance of the Iranian community because of the food he serves, which helps dispel some of the negative feeling that many Americans had for his country. So he is a culinary ambassador, which gets me to another point. How many of you know that the United States State Department has a culinary ambassador program? One. Okay, well, tell me how you know.
Because one of my professors told me that there's such a thing as like cultural ambassadors that are becoming really popular now, and the State Department is not influencing, but they have a lot of programs to get like more young people like interested in like the whole soft power idea instead of like all the hard power.
Absolutely, right on point. You know the term soft power. I'm sure you've heard about that. You take political science. Well, food diplomacy is a part of soft power. When a country projects its power, it can project it in many ways. We can have sports diplomacy. We send athletes to foreign countries. We have the Fulbright program where we send scholars to countries. We have cultural programs where we send hip-hop bands to Burma. Do you know that, by the way? We have all kinds of programs. And these types of things project not only United States influence, but they have tremendous impact on a wide population because they show a different side of American culture. Well, food has become the new foreign policy tool. And during Secretary Clinton's time, she set up a chef's corps where she identified very well-known regional chefs around the country. And these chefs who work for free were put into this, quote, chef's corps, and they were deployed to different countries to cook at embassies to show off the diversity of American cooking. And that is something that is going on today as we speak. In fact, on April 21st, they'll have the second chef's corps training. But the point is that we project our power also through our food. Now, the United States doesn't have one food, which is the beauty of the diversity of our culture. So we have Rick Bayless, who cooks Mexican food, going to Africa. We had Jose Andres going to Haiti. We had all kinds of different chefs. John Besh from New Orleans goes, I think they've sent him to Asia. They go to embassies on holidays to cook food, which is totally unexpected. So these are the kinds of things that are very much part of how food, coming around the table, as we said, becomes part of American power as well. Very, very interesting in terms of what it means. And well worth, meeting some of these chef corps. Even the White House chef who just left, the first woman head chef, Krista Comerford, I had here last year, she was part of the chef's corps. And they're all, they wear their blue uniforms and they have a little seal of the United States on them. It's a really interesting phenomenon. When I guess it was, when we have foreign visitors, some of these chefs are called to cook for them. So when the French Prime Minister came, John Besh from New Orleans came because they felt he would like in a French cuisine a la New Orleans, a Creole cuisine. And so that's what they served at the White House. So, there is a lot of thought goes into planning it. Now, we didn't invent culinary diplomacy. We didn't invent a lot of things. But culinary diplomacy, which country really invented it? Well, France was the actual implementer of it. Escoffier decided that French would use their power of persuasion with their great cuisine to get negotiations in Europe going. But actually, the Romans used culinary diplomacy. When they won a battle, they did a feast, and they invited to co-opt people, their losers, around a table so that they could feed people. And they would show off their great feasts after these conquests. And it's well documented that this happens. So the idea of culinary diplomacy is very, very much a part of history, of using food as a tool to co-opt your enemies, to create persuasion. But how many of you have heard of the term gastrodiplomacy? Good. What does it mean?
Gastrodiplomacy is when a foreign government targets a foreign audience with their cuisine. It's kind of like what I think Thailand was the first one that implemented.
You must have read my course or taken it last year.
It was Paul Rockhauer's.
Oh, you know Paul Rockhauer?
I've read his article.
Yeah, Paul is really, this is a young man who went to the Annenberg School of Communications, studied public diplomacy, and he is actually coming to my conference next month. Paul got me into this also when I met him as a blogger. Gastrodiplomacy is what I would call citizen-to-citizen food diplomacy, as opposed to the high diplomacy that you use in diplomatic settings. But you all practice gastrodiplomacy. Anytime you go into an ethnic restaurant, you're practicing gastrodiplomacy. So how many do you know that we have a Laotian restaurant in Washington? Wonderful Laotian restaurant. And this is just another example of how a Laotian family decided to use its cuisine as a way to people to learn more about their country. And a really very good cuisine, in fact, very different in South Asian qualities than a Cambodian or a Vietnamese cuisine. Different tastes, different use of animal meat and vegetable meat, but once again, gastrodiplomacy. So I'm glad you know about Paul Rockhauer. He has been, as I say, one of the leaders in this movement, but how many have heard of Conflict Kitchen in Pittsburgh? Okay, what do you know about that?
It's a kitchen in it's a restaurant in Pittsburgh where they have, I think they rotate it every few months or something, and they, or several months, and they have they serve the food of a different country that the U.S. is currently at war with, and they have other events and stuff that are surrounding it as well.
Did you ever try it? Have you been there?
No, I haven't. I really wanted to go there.
Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody try it who knows about it? You did?
Well, I haven't tried it yet, but I did my undergrad in Pittsburgh, and the restaurant opened up a year or so after I had left, but I do know a bunch of friends that have gone there.
Yeah. I'm supposed to go up and meet with their chef. They're the only group, I must say, as a footnote, that wanted to charge me an honorarium to have them come to my conference, even though I was willing to pay their travel. So I have a doubt. Their theory is that food builds peace, but they also identify enemies of the United States that I don't think are enemies of the United States. So that's my beef with them. But they're an art movement. They don't consider themselves a political movement. They are a performance art of which food is a tool of performance art. And I've seen other programs like this. I was in Stuttgart about 2 years ago in the main Modern Art Museum, and they also had food art as a performance to show the use of food as a way of showing a certain type of aspect of daily life. But since we are in a place that deals with the spirit as well, I wanted to just, talk a little bit more about food and religion, because I think that's important also. Every religion has some role for food, whether it's Christian, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam. Food plays a different role and has a different value. So, for example, there are in almost every religion rituals like fast days and feast days. So we're coming soon to Easter, which is a season of feast. It also coincides, of course, with the harvest time and people eat. But there is, before Easter, this whole period of Lent where people forego foods as a sign of purification, as a sign of ritual. So you always have this link with food. In the Jewish religion, you have the laws of kashrut, of being kosher. And I don't know if anybody, if you saw, there was a show, even the Discovery Channel is doing a show called Breaking Borders with Michael Votaggio and this woman, Marianne von Zeller, about food building peace or war. I for one, I wasn't convinced by it, but one of the big hang-ups is Michael Voltaggio, the brother of the chef Brian Voltaggio, for those of you who follow the Food Network. He was so hung up on kashrut, on kosher food, because in the meal he was preparing for Palestinians and Israelis, the food had to be kosher. And the way they handled it is they made it almost like a bugaboo. You know, this is so hard. It's not hard. I mean, the rules are pretty straightforward. And it would have been very useful on this program, and I suggest you air it. You can probably see it on Hulu or one of the many services, was that he sort of took away from the meaning of what the food would be at this dinner because he was so crazed about not mixing dairy and meat and going to a kosher butcher in Jerusalem to make sure that the lamb he purchased was done. But anyway, there are rules, whether it's in a Christian sect or a Jewish sect or an Islam, there are rules. But what's interesting is that the Jewish rules of kashrut have also been used as tools against them to punish Jews. And let me just give you some examples. In the Middle Ages, Spain had a huge Jewish population before the Reconquest. And I was reading a very interesting article the other day which talked about in Castilla, the Jewish community and the Christian community shared an abattoir, a slaughterhouse. But the way in which animals are to be killed, which are very similar to the way animals are to be slaughtered in the Islam faith, where they are to be painlessly executed, and then having their blood drained, which makes the meat safe. Jewish butcher shops and Christian shops shared the abattoir because they only had space for one. But sometimes the meat would not be properly drained of blood, or something would go wrong, or if an animal has a defect, it's not kosher, even if after it's slaughtered. So these animals would be sold. They weren't poisonous. There's a whole rule in the laws. And they would be sold to non-Jews. But apparently they would be sold below market value because they were no longer worth it to the Jewish community. This was used as a reason to not and boycott Jewish butchers because they felt they were undercutting Gentile butchers. They also were not allowed to slaughter meat during certain periods. So in Salamanca, any Christian butcher who sold meat to Jews during Carnival would have his head shaved, for example, as a punishment. And it was a source of conflict, even the way you killed an animal and the way you sold it. And it's very, very interesting that the economic conditions for markets in these areas were very much affected by the religious methods by which animals were slaughtered. So, I mean, not only did Jews get subject to prejudice, but they were also subject to all of these other things. But how many of you have heard of Saint Benedict? Talk about the Middle Ages. Well, Benedict, in his rules, had very specific rules about how to eat. In monasteries, there were very, very specific.
Microphone
Oh.
a little bit closer.
Okay.
It's not amplified, unfortunately.
Oh.
No, it's to record.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry. And you probably have not heard me because I've been relaxing and sitting back. But Benedict had these very specific rules of behavior in the monastery. Now, people think of a monastery as a place where you withhold food or are operating in an ascetic way. That was really not the case. There were just rules about times of day when you ate, things that you could eat, the way meals were prepared. But the other thing that it taught is that food was also about hospitality, because you came together, and when people came in the Middle Ages, we didn't have Hyatt House or Marriott's, they would stop at monasteries. And hospitality was one of the functions of these institutions, where people could go and get a meal or eat something and be taken care of. So they, in some ways, were the first part of a hospitality industry, which is where that concept comes from. The other thing is, how many think about manners, how you behave at the table? I'm sure your parents told you a lot about how to behave at the table, right? How you didn't. A young woman, Tamar Adler, who writes for the New York Times, she's one of the new food writers, wrote a very tongue-in-cheek article about how crazy her father was about table manners and how he would punish them if they didn't hold their fork right or didn't do things in a certain way. But in fact, manners are important because they distinguish how people of, quote, culture eat. And they also have a certain bent towards class. That the way upper class people ate or ate their soup or did perform certain types of cutting, like in the European sense, people hold their fork in the left hand. Only the United States doesn't hold their fork in the left. We hold our fork in the right hand, but we cut our food in a different way. These are all related and signs of class. Not so much today, but they are. Finally, I don't want to take all my time because this goes till 1 or 1:30.
Usually we wrap up
At 1.
between 1 and
So
1:15.
what I want to say is that next time you sit down and come around the table, you're doing something that has history, that has politics, that has ritual, and that also has meaning because it's a way for you to reach out. In the United States, until the 1930s, we really didn't eat many things that were creative or interesting. The immigrant population brought loads and loads of food, and I can give you some recommendations of things to read about that. But you know what the most popular food in the America was in the 19th century? Anybody take a guess? Well, that was one of them. There's a good thing about potatoes. Pie. Pie. When people talk about American as apple pie, it is because people ate pie for breakfast, pie for lunch, and pie for dinner. And people would go to rooming houses. They'd eat meat pies. In certain areas along the coast, like New York, the other most popular food was oysters because the seashores were filled with oysters. When you hear about oyster bars today, you say, ooh, isn't that exotic? No, that's what people ate. They ate oysters and they ate pie. When immigrants started coming to the United States, and the flow started at the end of the 19th century and continued till the exclusion laws started at the end of the 1920s, the cornucopia of food that arrived on our shores and the recipes was amazing. Sausages, hot dogs, sauerkraut. There was a man in New York whose sole job it was to go from family to family in a tenement and make the sauerkraut every year. Bar food. Think bar food is something new? Bar food originated with the Irish, who opened pubs and started serving food as a means of getting people in to start drinking in the morning. I think that still happens. Maybe the day after St. Patrick's Day is not the day to talk about that. Blintzes, knishes. Eastern European Jews come and they start selling things that are from their background, and they are peddlers. And people go on the street and they eat this food. Ice cream. Well, ice cream there was in America because George Washington actually had slaves who made him ice cream. But the point is, there are certain things that come with immigrant populations that become American. There's even a very funny story that a very famous rabbi in New York, Rabbi Wise, who was the dean of the changing movement, found a rationale to eat oysters, which technically are not kosher because they're in a shell, because he said the shell protected them from poisonous gases because he happened to like the taste of oysters. But the point is, the disruption of immigration also creates a disruption in our food system. And while I'd love to talk more about the farm-to-table movement, the farmers market, I don't think we have time for that, but I'd love to hear what you think of how food is in your life, because we did come around a table to eat pizza, the Pope's favorite food, so I think I'd be really eager to hear what you think about this. And yes.
Well, I mean, especially to me, like as we were talking about earlier, being an ambassador from your country. My great uncle was the first one in my family to move here, and I don't know if you know, not many people in South India usually move out of South India. It's mostly like if you move from India, it's usually from North India around the Delhi area or Mumbai.
Right.
So it's like always, it's kind of interesting to see, oh, a South Indian person. Like if I see someone else South Indian, I'll get really excited because you never see them there, especially not from Tamil Nadu. So my great uncle was telling me before he passed away, he was telling me that it's very like it's important for me to be an ambassador. And my so like coming to college is when it's really hitting me, and like sharing my food with my friends. Like they've never seen any of these things whatsoever, and even if people here have like eaten Indian food, they haven't eaten South Indian food. So I guess like it's such a huge cultural difference, and even within one country, moving north to south. So like expressing that to my friends here is it's really interesting.
Well, the point you raise is especially interesting because UNESCO, the United Nations Economic and Social and Cultural Organization, recognizes culinary heritage as an intangible heritage. Now, the United States doesn't buy into that treaty because we don't like economic and social rights, but we won't go there today. We won't go there today. But Mexican food, Korean food, Peruvian food, Thai food, all of these foods have been designated by UNESCO as cultural heritage foods. Japanese also, the omakase food, the order, the ritual of the way Japanese foods has been given that designation. What does that mean? It means that these traditions have to be preserved so that future generations can also understand these diverse roots. Someone mentioned potatoes. You mentioned potatoes. The history of the potato is one of the most fascinating in global history because the potatoes are indigenous to the Americas. South and North America produced corn, potatoes, peppers, tomatoes, and that little dog that you gave your daughter for dinner. And these foods, there was no tomato sauce in Italy until the New World, and there was no peppers until we had the New World. Potatoes went to Ireland from the New World. There were about 564 varieties of potatoes that grew in the Andes. And one factoid is that since McDonald's came to South America, they have had a very disruptive effect on the potato industry because, when you make a French fry from McDonald's, it has to come from a potato of a certain size, of a certain variety. And it's created diversification, but away from the cultivation of these more unique potatoes. I mean, if you've ever been in an Andean market and seen, people splayed out with all these different, hundreds of varieties of little sweet potatoes and big sweet potatoes, and the McDonald's phenomenon is having a negative effect on some of this. But the potato famine, which of course afflicted Europe tremendously, and not only Ireland, I mean, almost all of Europe was affected by this. It was a fungus that got onto the potato and destroyed the crop. But there is a book called 1493. I don't know if any of you have read that book. It's by Charles Mann, a journalist. His 1492 and 1493, and it's sort of the impact of the New World on the Old World. He has a chapter on the potato, which is definitely worth a read. It's about 40 pages of the most incredible history of how people died from the potato famine and why so many of the Irish came to the Americas in mid-century was precisely because of the starvation in Europe. So I will keep quiet.
That has in turn affected immigration in that the United States has a total ban on immigrants from Ireland coming here, although 330 million Americans, 33 million identify as Irish, and so there's a large group of Irish lawyers in D.C. that are constantly meeting and trying to get changes in immigration law. And even the president, I think, caught on to the fact that it might be more politically expedient to say, we don't bring any people, we don't allow any people in here from Ireland. Oh, and then they also have the problem with Hispanics, blah, 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 blah. But Ireland flows off the tongue easier, and people are less likely. First of all, they're most likely to be shocked if you can't have immigration, you can't take a job here if you're from Ireland. But secondly, it's a way of making immigration bills more appealable to a lot of people in Congress.
A lot of the undocumented immigrants in New York are Irish.
Yeah.
Right. And what is the reason for that exclusion? Was it because of the conflict
So many.
that want to come? It's like the Dominican Republic.
Such a high proportion of the population, it's deemed that you don't need any more people of Irish birth coming
Right.
here.
But that you can come in on two ways. You can come in on a lottery system, which is open to everybody, and you can come in through sponsorship. And a lot of the way people come is through relatives that eventually.
They will not let Irish lawyers, for example, come in through sponsorship. They will
That's interesting. I did not know, and I studied immigration, but it's been a while since I practiced it.
It goes back to food. I mean, if all the Irish hadn't come here when there was famine, there wouldn't be as many people here, and then they would have different immigration.
Well,
So it affects just so much of our everyday.
But I'll tell you another phenomena to go back full circle to where we started about you could tell where the wars were by the restaurants. One of the unintended consequences of 9/11 was that immigration stopped from many of these countries that were in conflict. And so you don't see new Syrian restaurants. You don't see new Afghan restaurants. The Afghan restaurants that are here are from the 79 diaspora. You don't see people coming from countries where there are conflicts in Southeast Asia. You don't see people coming from Indonesia. We have basically closed our doors. And because we've closed our doors, the phenomena that was so much a characteristic of our city is much harder to find. Yes, there are the occasional Iraqis that open restaurants because they were military officers or translators that ultimately got in, but it is the minority now.
Do you have a number on Chinese restaurants? I mean, honestly, since I've come to AU, which is now like 18 years ago, there used to be a million Chinese restaurants. And almost all of them around this area have closed as families work very, very hard to assimilate into the American way, and their kids who become doctors or lawyers or dentists are like, I don't want to run a restaurant. I'm an American mom and dad. And so just around this area, and then also in Chinatown, in part because of prices.
Well, that's gentrification.
That's, I mean, the gentrification, but there is still the issue of children trying to assimilate and do better than work those unbelievable hours that the immigrants are working in those restaurants.
Well, there's a very funny article about the four-legged duck written by a Chinese American, and then there was a new one. There's a good Chinese writer in the New Yorker called Zheng Fan, who wrote about the same phenomenon. Where is the general? And General Tso's chicken. I mean, these invented dishes, talking about this phenomena of the provenance of Chinese food and how it is adapted to American taste. So when you see a Panda Express in an airport or in a food court, it's not Chinese food. Yet there is a very interesting article that Tim Carmen, who's going to be at my conference, the Cheap Eats writer from the Post, wrote today about this Chinese chef who had been the embassy chef here at and a very hard life. He had been part of the Cultural Revolution, worked really hard. It's a wonderful article to read. Actually took asylum. He left the embassy, and he and his wife snuck out one morning and opened. Now he's a big entrepreneur and doing well, and he's opening all these Chinese food restaurants. But he actually had to operate under an alias for many years because of his fear that the Chinese would go after the Republic of China would come after his family in China. But he's safe now. But it's a worthwhile article because it tells you again how these chefs have adopted to what we call American taste, which I don't know that is necessarily bad because recipes evolve. Just like the recipe you made for your grandmother evolved from somebody's idea of, how could we use fast food and how could we put things together and make a wonderful dish. And time is the other constraint. But I am completely amazed by many of the people your age who are opening up their homes and really experimenting with food and inviting you over to join them. So I suggest take a look at Eater DC. If you ever need something to do on a Saturday night, sign up. They're $35 meals. You get full meals. You go to somebody's house. You meet new people. It's probably better than J-Date or whatever in some way. But I think, it would be an interesting type of thing to do. Anybody else have a comment? Yes.
I thought that was really interesting, sort of the discussion you were talking about. You can tell where the next war is going to be by the proliferation of restaurants related to that locale, right? So I was reading yesterday about sort of the opposite happening in relation to Irish pubs and how they really started booming at home and all over the world.
St. Patrick's Day season
Right.
push to have tourists come and enjoy this sort of essentialized Irish culture. And I'm just kind of wondering your thoughts on that, whether or not there's maybe a negative side to sort of, maybe are we stereotyping? Are we saying that sort of,
Well,
Irish are, they love to drink? And, is that maybe a negative side of that?
Well, I think you're raising a very important issue. Well, two that you raise. One, will we see more restaurants of different countries that are coming out of war? Interesting question. And number two, the issue of public-private partnerships with private citizens, working with a government tourism office, as they do in Ireland, and a private entity like Guinness, which is a beer-making company and alcohol company, coming together and working. There's a lot of that going on, especially in terms of nation branding, of a country identifying itself with, for tourism purposes with a certain cuisine or a certain event. So Peru has become a food destination now. Who would have thought that a country that had Sendero Luminoso, this one of those most brutal guerrillas movements of dysfunctional government, now is a foodie place. And you have every chef that goes there on tours to taste these incredible dishes. And there is another phenomenon also. Food is a very good career for young people. And a lot of countries are using their vocational education systems to try and train people to be chefs and to create their own foods. And that's happening in Peru. I just heard that Marriott teamed up with Jose Andres' NGO, World Global Kitchen, to start training Haitian chefs for the hospitality industry. So there are positive sides to this when things begin to get better. I also recommend, and one day we should show it here, there's a film that was made by a young filmmaker, Yael Lutfa, called Slim Peace, which is much better than the Breaking Borders story. It's about how Palestinian and Israeli women, both of whom had weight problems, came together around a Mediterranean diet. And they had nutritionists who were both Palestinian and Israeli, and women who would never talk to each other, women who had nothing to do with each other, cross borders to actually come to these Weight Watcher-like meetings because they were all so caring about their appearance and their health. It's not called Weight Watchers, but they are using this technique as a way of bridging much more irreconcilable differences. And food can do that. It really can. So maybe I should start looking for Colombian restaurants. Maybe I should look for more Cuban restaurants.
You shouldn't look for Irish cuisine. The ambassador frequently has events, and I happen to be there like 3 weeks in a row, and everything is identical. And Irish cuisine appears to consist of white bread sandwiches with the
Crust?
crust cut off, and Guinness and Bailey's. Way more alcohol than is fast food, but it's so identifiable as what people in Ireland do eat every day, and it's a completely bland
Right.
diet. So when you look here to Irish pubs, the food early on was much more like close to home.
Right.
But now if you go to Bordeaux or those places, they've Americanized food completely, and I've never heard an Irish person go into a restaurant and go, oh, this is what I get at home. I mean, they're looking for something better than what they get at home.
On Irish cuisine, in this book, 97 Orchard Street, which is the history of the Tenement Museum, it actually is a history that traces the lives of immigrants through their food. The least impressive chapter is what Irish poor ate, because it was mainly an oatmeal-based diet or oat cakes with some eggs for protein, and they really, they did not like their neighbors' cooking, where they had more spices in the German food or more different cuts of meat in the Russian Jewish or the Polish Jews. But it's an interesting study because they were the least impressive in terms of food, not in terms of their accomplishments. So
You've mentioned several books, articles, and movies. I was wondering if maybe Christine could get it to me, or I could put it up on Blackboard for people in the class who might be
Sure.
interested, because you've mentioned several interesting things.
Each time I come across new things that are really fascinating, but I the book 97 Orchard Street, for those of you interested in immigration, traces these 5 different immigrant families that live in this same tenement. But the records that they use are the records of their food and what they purchased. But what was especially interesting in that book was the biggest purveyors of food in the turn of the century were the steamship companies. Because when you got to Ellis Island, you didn't get off immediately. Sometimes you had to be dormered there because your relatives would be in Kansas or Chicago and they had not made it to pick you up. So the steamship companies ran these huge cafeterias. And one of the big fights that kept on going on as the nature of the immigrants changed was that, first of all, immigrants who came were usually quite poor. They came steerage, and they had never thought of the phenomenon of getting anything free. And these companies, as part of your steerage ticket, actually had to house you so that they had menus, and the menus are, part of the historical record. And then there was an issue when the Jewish immigrants came, because they served a lot of pork and beans, which was cheap. They had to get different foods to accommodate the dietary functions of different groups. So it's quite interesting. Today when we have, are you vegan-free, are you gluten-free? I mean, this was interesting. And the companies made a fortune off of the buying of food and then, selling it to the steamship companies. There was a lot of corruption. Teddy Roosevelt, when he was commissioner of police and then governor and then eventually president, was very instrumental in getting regulations about how the companies would feed people in these dormitories. So another phenomenon we didn't even know. And they had signs on the walls, this food is free. We will not charge you for this food, because people, they discovered they weren't eating. And the reason they weren't eating was because of the food. Now, another phenomenon, the settlement house movement, which many of you know about, the United States at the turn of the century believed milk was the perfect food for children. Now, many people are lactose intolerant, but the first thing that you got when you got off the boat was a glass of milk and cookies. That was what you got. And people, they looked like they were crazy. Many people didn't see milk, especially from the Asian cultures. And it was very fascinating to read about what was conceived of by the American nutritionists at the turn of the century of what the perfect food should be. So
one thing to note, I just read a book, speaking of Irish food and the famine. A lot of people think that the Irish famine was because there was a lack of food. There was actually plenty of food in Ireland. It was being shipped out by the occupying British to send to England. There's a fantastic book that I just read called The Famine Plot, about how the Irish famine was actually a genocide. And it was a controversial book that was just written. It was very good and explained sort of the history of the potato and why Irish food is so bland, because the majority of Ireland were tenant farmers, and were subsiding on the potato because they really couldn't eat anything else because it was taken out of Ireland away from them. So that's a big reason why Irish food is so bland.
Well, how many of
traditionally?
you
very interesting book.
Oh, I would like to read it. How many of you know that starvation is a crime of war? It's actually in the Geneva Conventions. To starve populations is a crime of war. And if you look at, what is going on in Syria today, just to bring it to the real time, do you know what the most popular way of getting people killed is? To wait in line in a bakery. Because in the Middle East, bread is very much a part of every meal. In Egypt, there were subsidies on wheat and bread, and when those were taken away, there were riots, bread riots. Same thing in Syria. Everybody goes to the bakery in the morning to get their morning bread. They go in the afternoon. And Assad's troops have been bombing people as they see them in their sights on lines in bakery. There is a Human Rights Watch report on deaths at bakery. 60,000 people they've documented have been killed waiting on line for a loaf of bread. So it's not only the street battles or the asymmetrical threats of terrorists, but it's also just targeting innocent people looking for something to eat. We found a Facebook page from Syria also of how to cook in times of famine. That was from Homs, the city of Homs. Last year, Homs was under siege. The fighting has moved over. But once again, people are creative, and even with social media, they put things up on how to eat in times of famine. So imagine if they had Facebook during World War II, it would have been different. But